For
Benny Hill was the
34
most
years,
successful
Benny
comedian the
Hill
world
made
has
the
ever
entire
known.
world laugh at the same time.
He was the lad from Southampton
His
who
show
did the
ran
rounds
in
of the
more than
music halls,
100 countries.
working men's clubs,
In
doing the jokes,
1971,
and ended
over
up being
21
lauded
million
by
people in
television
Britain
audiences
alone
in
tuned
90
in to watch a
countries.
middle-aged man in a checkered suit chase women around a park at double speed. Businesses in some towns rearranged their schedules around it. Then, in 1989, without a phone call of warning, Thames Television ended it. No farewell special. No final bow. Just a meeting, a handshake, and silence. The official reason sounded almost too simple for a fall this large: falling ratings, rising costs. But underneath that simple explanation was something bigger, a culture that had quietly decided it no longer wanted to laugh at what it used to laugh at. What actually happened in that room, and in the years leading up to it, is stranger and sadder than most people realize. Let's find out. But before we get into what really happened, stay with us, because the full story goes far deeper than a single meeting at Teddington Lock. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born in Southampton in January 1924, the son of a shopkeeper who sold surgical appliances. He left school young, worked as a milkman, a driver, and a stagehand, and spent his early 20s absorbing the rhythms of English music hall, the timing, the innuendo, the art of making an audience laugh at exactly the right half-second. During the Second World War, he served in the Royal Army Ordnance Corps and later performed for troops, sharpening the instincts that would define his career: read the room, never rush the punchline, let the silence do some of the work. After the war, he took the stage name Benny in tribute to the American comedian Jack Benny, whose deadpan control he admired more than any other performer of the era. Hill's first television appearance came in 1949, and by 1954 he had already been voted Television Personality of the Year. His self-titled sketch show launched on the BBC on January 15, 1955, blending music hall slapstick with a new grammar of television: quick cuts, visual gags, and characters that could shift from menace to buffoonery in a single frame. The real transformation came in 1969, when Hill moved his show to Thames Television. Freed from the BBC's tighter scheduling, Thames gave him room to produce hour-long specials whenever they were ready, usually 3 or 4 a year, each one meticulously written, scored, and directed almost entirely by Hill himself. He wrote the sketches, composed the songs, and by some estimates authored more than 90% of everything that aired under his name. Recurring characters like Fred Scuttle and the perpetually slapped Jackie Wright became household names. The show's closing theme, Yakety Sax, turned every high-speed chase finale into a piece of instantly recognizable comedy shorthand. Decades later it would be voted the nation's favorite theme tune in a UK poll. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, The Benny Hill Show wasn't just popular in Britain, it was one of the country's most successful cultural exports. It aired across roughly 100 countries. In the United States, edited half-hour versions ran in syndication and became a cult phenomenon, reportedly earning Thames somewhere in the region of £100 million over the life of the franchise, a large share of it from American sales alone. Hill received a BAFTA for writing in 1972, Emmy nominations in 1980 and 1981, and the Rose d'Or in 1984. He was, by any measure, one of the most-watched comedians who has ever lived. And for a long time, almost nobody in Britain questioned why. But underneath the record-breaking numbers, a specific kind of criticism had been quietly building for years, and it wasn't really about Benny Hill the man. It was about the shape of the jokes themselves. Chase sequences where women, often in various states of undress, were pursued by Hill and his cast of aging, leering men. Sketches built on double entendre, so consistent it became a genre unto itself. Defenders, and there were many, including Hill, argued the joke was always on the men, who were portrayed as ridiculous, sweaty, and unsuccessful, never as conquerors. Hill himself maintained that his female characters kept their dignity, while the men chasing them were the true fools of the piece. Critics saw something else, a decade-after-decade pattern of treating women's bodies as the punchline's raw material, regardless of who technically won the chase. And by the mid-1980s, British comedy itself was changing shape around him. New generation of comedians, sharpened by the launch of Channel 4 in 1982 and shows like The Comic Strip Presents and The Young Ones, were building careers on being everything the old guard wasn't: political, self-aware, and explicitly opposed to jokes that punched down. This wasn't a fringe movement anymore. It had a name: alternative comedy. And it had a face that was more than happy to go looking for a fight. Hold on to that detail, because the man who became the face of that fight is the same man who would eventually stand accused of ending Benny Hill's career. In January 1987, on the television show Saturday Live and in the pages of Q magazine, comedian Ben Elton made an allegation that went far beyond calling Hill's humor old-fashioned. Elton argued that the show's content actively contributed to real-world harm toward women, telling audiences that women in Britain could no longer walk safely through a park. It was a direct causal claim, not that the show was tasteless, but that it was dangerous. He repeated versions of this argument across television appearances over the following months, including a pointed exchange on a Wogan interview in which he described the female roles on Hill's show as nothing more than objects. The backlash to Elton's attack was almost as loud as the attack itself. One writer for The Independent compared the spectacle to watching an elderly uncle being kicked to death by young thugs. GQ magazine dismissed the entire premise, arguing that blaming a comedian for crime statistics made no more sense than blaming a concert pianist for elephant poaching. Elton, for his part, never fully backed down, and years later he satirized his own crusade in a Harry Enfield sketch, playing a self-righteous character named Benny Elton, who gets chased through the woods by angry women to the tune of yakety sax, a joke aimed as much at himself as at anyone. But the argument had already done its work. It gave a name and a face to a discomfort that had been building quietly for a decade, and it moved that discomfort out of pub conversations and newspaper columns and into the offices of people who actually controlled programming decisions. A spokesman for the Broadcasting Standards Council later remarked publicly that the show's central convention, young women in states of undress being pursued across the screen, was becoming increasingly offensive to modern sensibilities, and simply wasn't as funny as it once seemed. By 1988, Thames had already begun quietly retreating from the show's most notorious signature. The Hills Angels dancers, the show's most visible symbol of everything its critics objected to, were dropped. The content was toned down. It didn't matter. In June 1989, Thames's newly appointed head of light entertainment, John Howard Davies, called Hill in for a meeting. Hill, fresh off a triumphant appearance at the Cannes Television Festival, believed he was there to discuss a new series. Instead, he was told the show was finished. Davies later explained his reasoning simply: audiences were shrinking, the specials were extraordinarily expensive to make, and Hill himself was starting to look tired on camera. There was no leaked tape, no single scandalous broadcast, and no dramatic on-air confrontation. Just a private meeting, a quiet cancellation, and a press release. Oh, understand why this ending felt so sudden to the public and so inevitable to the people making the decision. It helps to look at what was actually happening underneath the surface, because it wasn't really about one comedian. First, the numbers had genuinely slipped. The show that once drew over 21 million viewers in 1971 pulled in roughly 9.5 million for its final Thames broadcast in 1989. Still a respectable audience by most standards, but a steep decline from its peak, and enough to make the specials look far less justifiable on a spreadsheet. Second, the cost of producing each special had climbed to roughly £450,000, a considerable sum for a network watching its margins in a shifting advertising landscape. Third, and least quantifiable but arguably most decisive, was the reputational cost. By the late 1980s, being publicly associated with content that critics were calling sexist carried a different kind of risk for a network than it had a decade earlier. Regulatory bodies were paying closer attention. Press coverage had shifted from celebratory to skeptical. A show that had once been treated as a national treasure was now, in some circles, treated as an embarrassment a modern broadcaster needed to explain rather than defend. None of these three pressures alone would likely have ended a show earning Thames tens of millions of pounds in international sales. Together, they gave the network's leadership every justification it needed to make a decision that, on the numbers alone, still looked debatable. There's a fourth factor worth naming, because it explains why the ending felt so abrupt to the public even though the pressure had been building for years. Hill had no seat at the table where this decision was made. He wasn't a network executive with allies in the boardroom. He was a supplier, enormously successful, but still a supplier, and suppliers get dropped quietly, without negotiation, the moment the internal cost-benefit calculation tips the wrong way. The people defending the show loudest in the press were, for the most part, not the people who controlled its fate. That mismatch between public sentiment and private decision-making is a pattern that shows up again and again whenever a long-running institution decides it's time to move on from something it built. But the most disorienting part of this story isn't the cancellation itself, it's what happened, and didn't happen, to Benny Hill afterward. Hill did not go quietly into obscurity by choice. In late May 1989, after 21 years with Thames, he announced he was taking a year off, language that suggested a pause, not an ending. He spent that year attempting a comeback, developing a new project called Benny Hill's World Tour, which would take his sketches to the cities where his show had found its biggest international audiences. He managed to complete exactly one special, filmed in New York, before the project quietly died. No British network picked up a follow-up series. The phone, for the first time in 4 decades, had essentially stopped ringing. Former cast members from the Hill's Angels years reportedly continued visiting him, but those close to him described a man who never fully processed what had happened. The sudden, complete removal of the only professional identity he had built since he was a young man delivering milk in Southampton. He lived modestly, largely out of public view, in the years that followed. He never married, had no children, and by most accounts spent his final years increasingly isolated. He had reportedly turned down competing offers from other networks in the meantime, still holding out hope for the right project rather than simply taking any work available. Then, in April 1992, 3 years after the cancellation, Central Independent Television sent Hill a new contract in the post, offering him a fresh series of specials. Benny Hill died of a heart attack before he ever opened it. He was found in his flat 2 days later. The BBC program Living Famously, and later obituary coverage, would note the timing as one of the story's cruelest details. The industry that had walked away from him tried to walk back on the very day it was too late to matter. The human cost of this story rarely gets weighed against the cultural argument that ended his career. Whatever one believes about the content of his sketches, the man who wrote nearly all of it, directed much of it, and built one of the most watched entertainment franchises in television history spent his last years functionally unemployable in his own country, dying alone with an unopened job offer sitting in his mailbox. Today, the reputation of The Benny Hill Show occupies a strange and unsettled place. For 20 years after his death, it was barely rebroadcast on British terrestrial television. Then gradually it began resurfacing, first on niche and archive channels, later in full uncut form on streaming and specialty networks, and it remains a steady presence in syndication in multiple countries. The show's theme song still tops nostalgia polls. Comedians and critics remain split on how to talk about it. Some treat it as an artifact of a less careful era, worth studying but not defending. Others argue the entire moral panic around it was disproportionate to begin with, aimed more at making a political point about a changing culture than at protecting anyone in particular. What the Benny Hill story ultimately reveals isn't really a verdict about one man's jokes. It's a case study in how quickly an entire culture can renegotiate what it's willing to laugh at, and how little warning the people caught in that renegotiation are typically given. Hill was, in many ways, a bystander to his own downfall, a performer who kept making the same kind of comedy that had made him famous, while the world around that comedy quietly changed its mind. He never got the chance to evolve on his own terms, and Thames never gave the public a real conversation about the transition, only a press release explaining a decision that had already been made behind closed doors. Whether you see him as a comic genius undone by shifting politics, a relic whose humor had genuinely aged out of relevance, or something uncomfortably in between, the emptiness of his final years raises a harder question than was the show sexist. It asks what a culture owes the entertainers it builds up for decades, once it decides it's done with them. So here's the real question. Was Benny Hill a talented entertainer who simply got caught on the wrong side of a cultural shift, or had his brand of comedy genuinely earned its cancellation years before Thames finally pulled the plug? Do you think there was a version of this ending where he got the chance to evolve instead of just disappear? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation truly belongs to all of us. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives like this.